I met my ex-husband broken on the streets, and his secret shattered my heart. I recognized him by his walk before my mind allowed me to accept what my eyes were seeing. The same rounded shoulders, the same dragging steps, as if every movement cost him more than his body could afford. For a heartbeat, I thought I was making a mistake. Then he turned just a little, and the world around me narrowed down to a single filthy corner of the street. I had just stepped out of the bank, a folder of paperwork tucked under my arm, when I noticed a figure leaning over a dumpster at the far end of the block. He was sorting through torn plastic bags, shaking out scraps of soggy paper and wilted food. With careful, almost methodical movements, he pulled crushed aluminum cans free from the garbage and slipped them into an old, stained sack. His hands were rough and cracked, skin darkened by grime, fingers swollen and red at the knuckles. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. I might have kept walking if not for the way he shifted his weight, the line of his back, the tilt of his head. There was something familiar there, buried under the layers of dirt and exhaustion. My steps slowed of their own accord. I squinted against the afternoon light. My heart gave a strange, heavy jolt. No, I thought, it can't be. He shifted again, straightening just enough for me to see his face in profile. A thin, tangled beard clung to his jaw, mottled with streaks of white. His hair, once thick and neatly combed, now stuck out from his head in wild tufts streaked with gray and dust. His cheekbones had become sharp ridges under his skin, and his clothes hung from him in tired folds, stained with old sweat and God knew what else. He looked decades older than the last time I'd seen him. And yet, beneath all of that ruin, it was him. I stopped dead on the sidewalk. Pedestrians flowed around me like water around a stone. Car horns blared somewhere down the street. A bus rolled by, spewing smoke. I heard none of it clearly. Every sound faded behind the pounding in my ears. That's Elias, my mind whispered. The man who had once shared my bed, my table, my future. My ex-husband. My fingers tightened around the folder until the edges dug into my skin. Memories rose like ghosts. His laughter at the kitchen table, the way he used to arrive home smelling of concrete dust and engine oil, the calm certainty with which he talked about deadlines and building codes. The day he vanished. The small, cold letter that simply said, "Forgive me. It's better this way. Don't look for me." That letter had cracked me from the inside out. Years of fury, humiliation, and unanswered questions had piled up on that wound, layer upon layer, until anger felt safer than grief. I had imagined confronting him 1,000 times, telling him what he'd done to me. But not like this. Never like this. I thought, for one cowardly moment, about turning away. If I crossed the street now, if I moved quickly enough, he might never see me. I could carry on with my day, keep my life neatly separate from that ragged figure bent over a dumpster. I could pretend the past had stayed where I left it, in court papers, in empty rooms, in long nights filled with resentment rather than answers. Shame burned hot and sudden in my chest. I could not make my legs move. Some stubborn, deeper part of me refused to let this moment pass unnoticed. This man had once been the center of my world. Seeing him reduced to collecting cans like a ghost, picking through the ruins of his own life, was like looking at a terrible, distorted reflection of my own history. My heels clicked once on the pavement as I forced myself forward. Then again, each step felt heavier than the last. The closer I drew, the more details carved themselves into my memory. The frayed fringe of his jacket, the hole at the edge of his shoe where one toe peeked through, the crust of mud on his pants as if he had been sleeping on the ground. He sensed my approach somehow. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe he simply heard my shoes above the noise of the street. He straightened slowly, as if his spine resisted the movement, and turned his face in my direction. Our eyes met. The world shrank to that single, silent connection. For the briefest instant, his gaze was blank, as if I were just another passerby, another pair of eyes to avoid. Then recognition hit him like a blow. His pupils widened, his jaw slackened, and the blood seemed to drain from his face beneath the dirt. His hand tightened around the burlap sack until his knuckles went white under the grime. I saw what he saw, A woman older than the one he'd left behind. Lines at the corners of my mouth, silver strands hidden in my hair, a hard-earned steadiness in my eyes. But it was me, the wife he had abandoned so completely that I'd once wondered if I had imagined our years together. "Elias," I heard myself say. My voice came out thin, unsteady, like a stranger speaking through my mouth. He flinched. The sack slipped from his fingers and thudded against the pavement. Several cans rolled out, clattering and wobbling away. His lips shaped my name without sound. For a moment, he took a half-step backward, as if he meant to flee, hunched and limping down the street until he vanished into the crowd. He didn't run. He just stared, shoulders trembling, like a man on the edge of a cliff who has suddenly realized how far the drop is. "You shouldn't see me like this," he muttered at last, voice hoarse and low. He dropped his gaze to the ground. "Go home, Mara. Pretend you never saw me." Every rational instinct screamed at me to do just that. Walk away. Protect what little stability I'd regained. Let the past stay buried where it lay. Instead, I stepped closer. The smell hit me first: sour sweat, stale alcohol, trash, and that metallic tang of dried blood or rust. I tried not to let my face betray anything, though my stomach tightened. His eyes were sunken, ringed with dark hollows, lashes clumped together with grime. I could see the ghost of the man I had once loved in the angle of his jaw, the familiar curve of his nose, the scar on his brow from where a beam had fallen at a work site years ago. "What happened to you?" I asked. The words trembled and scraped their way out. "How did you end up like this?" He shook his head once, sharply, as if trying to dislodge the question. "It doesn't matter," he rasped. "This is my road, not yours. Go on." Something in that answer snapped the brittle barrier I'd built around my heart. "I deserve to know," I insisted, hearing the edge of my own voice. "You disappeared. You left me with debts, with rumors, with a life turned upside down. And now I find you here, picking through trash. Don't tell me it doesn't matter." He glanced around nervously, shoulders drawing inward. People passed by without seeing us, a woman in decent clothes and a man who looked like every other forgotten figure on the streets. The city, as always, was indifferent. "I did everything so you wouldn't have to carry this," he whispered finally. His hand trembled as he bent to pick up the fallen sack. "You weren't supposed to see me again. That was the point. That was the price." "The price of what?" I asked. His eyes flicked up to mine, and for the first time I saw something more than shame there. Fear, deep and rooted, the kind that had lived with him for years. "To save you," he said. The words fell between us like a stone dropped down a well, disappearing into depths I could not yet see. For a moment my vision blurred, and I realized I had stopped breathing. The edges of the world softened, pulsing with the rush of my heartbeat. "To save me from what?" I whispered. He opened his mouth as if to answer, but his body swayed. A strange pallor washed over him, even under the grime. His fingers loosened on the sack. His knees buckled. I reached for him on instinct. He collapsed against me with a weight that knocked the breath out of my chest. His head lolled against my shoulder, his eyes rolling back, his body limp. It was like holding the shell of the man I had married, hollowed out by something I didn't yet understand. "Help!" I cried, my voice cracking. The folder slipped from my arm and scattered papers across the sidewalk. "Someone, please." A few people stopped, drawn by the sight and the shout. A young man in a hoodie knelt to help me steady Elias's body. An older woman dug a phone out of her purse and dialed emergency services, giving the address in a shaky voice. Someone brought a bottle of water, though Elias was too far gone to drink. I knelt in the grime of the sidewalk, cradling his head in my lap, one hand brushing filthy hair back from his forehead. It was a gesture I hadn't made in decades, and yet my body remembered it with painful ease. I murmured his name, though I didn't know if he could hear me. When the ambulance finally arrived, its siren cutting through the afternoon air, the paramedics took one look at him and moved quickly. They checked his pulse, his breathing, his pupils. One of them asked me rapid questions. Did I know him? Had he collapsed before? Did he drink, use drugs, have any known conditions? "He's my ex-husband," I said, the words tasting absurdly foreign after years of avoiding them. I don't know anything else anymore. They loaded him onto a stretcher, his limbs hanging loosely, the sack of cans abandoned beside the dumpster. I climbed into the ambulance almost without thinking, my hands still shaking. The doors slammed shut behind me, sealing us into a small, bright box that smelled of antiseptic and rubber. As the vehicle jolted forward, I sat beside a stretcher and watched the monitor flicker with numbers I didn't fully understand. The paramedic spoke, but his words came in fragments: dehydrated, severe anemia, chronic malnutrition, possible infections. I nodded as if I could take it all in. All I truly saw was Elias's face, thin and ashen, lips cracked, stubble scraping like sandpaper against the oxygen mask. "To save you," he had said. The phrase echoed and echoed as the city blurred past the small rear window. Something old and hard inside me shifted, just a fraction, leaving behind a crack through which questions poured in. What had he done, and what had been done to him in the years we had spent hating each other from a distance? I thought I knew the story of my own life. In that ambulance, with the weight of his head and his ruin still lingering on my hands, I realized I had only ever known half of it. And the other half, whatever it was about to pull me into a truth I had not asked for, but could no longer avoid. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and stale air, the universal perfume of places where too many lies had been stitched together or taken apart. They wheeled Elias straight to the emergency room, leaving me standing temporarily useless in a corridor, clutching my discarded folder like a shield. A nurse took my information with the measured efficiency of someone who had heard it all before: name, relation, phone number, whether I could authorize anything. Ex-wife. I repeated, as if saying it enough times might make the situation less surreal. She nodded, wrote it down, and told me to wait. So I waited. I sat in a hard plastic chair under fluorescent lights that made everyone look a little sick. Time stretched and folded back on itself. People passed through the corridor, doctors in white coats, patients in gowns, family members whispering into phones. Occasionally a code blared on the intercom, and nurses hurried by with urgent purpose. None of it felt quite real. What felt real were the images replaying themselves behind my eyes. Elias stood at the kitchen counter of our old apartment, sleeves rolled up, hands stained with graphite from his sketches, talking about foundation depths and structural loads. Elias grinning when we signed the papers for our first tiny home, promising that one day he would build us something bigger with his own hands. Elias leaves for work before dawn, kissing my cheek with the casual affection of routine. And then Elias was gone. I had been 47 when he vanished. Old enough to have believed I understood how life worked, naive enough to be wrong. He had gone to work one morning like any other. By evening, he hadn't returned. By midnight, I was pacing the living room, calling his phone again and again, each unanswered ring tightening the knot in my stomach. The second day, I visited the site where his firm was managing a big public project, a complex of administrative buildings on the edge of the city. His coworkers looked at me with genuine surprise. They hadn't seen him since the morning before. They assumed he'd taken time off. No, they didn't know why. The third day, I went to the police, to hospitals, to the firm's headquarters. Fourth, I barely slept at all. On the fifth, a lawyer in an immaculate dark suit appeared at my door with an envelope addressed in Elias's handwriting. I remembered the feel of the paper between my fingers. Heavy, almost ceremonial. Inside, a single page with a few flat sentences. "Forgive me. It's better this way. Don't try to find me. Don't ask questions." There was no explanation, no apology I could recognize as such. Just a cold dismissal that fell on my chest like a concrete block. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. The lawyer stood there unemotional, as if delivering this kind of news was just part of his day. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said. He handed me another set of documents, terms, signatures I didn't understand, financial notices, explained something about accounts, obligations, settlements. I heard almost none of it. My world had narrowed to the ink on that page, to the finality of those ordinary words. Why? I had asked him, voice breaking. Why would he do this? The lawyer only shook his head. "I'm not authorized to discuss personal motives," he said. I was hired to deliver the message and handle certain procedures. If you have questions, you'll need to consult another attorney. I didn't hire another attorney. I didn't have the money, and more than that, I didn't have the strength. In the months that followed, life hit me with one blow after another. Notices arrived in the mail like a storm. Debts I hadn't known existed, loans in his name that had my signature on them, though I'd never held the pen. Accounts I thought we shared turned out empty. The small house we had bought with so much pride was seized. I fought as much as I could. I lost anyway. People talked, of course. Neighbors whispered theories. Family members asked sharp questions, slashed with contempt. Some thought Elias had run off with someone younger. Others believed he had hidden money somewhere and left me with the performance of being the poor, injured wife. A few muttered that I must have driven him away, that a man doesn't just flee his life unless something at home is unbearable. I didn't have answers for anyone. I barely had answers for myself. In time, the shock calcified into something harder. I moved into a cramped rented room with peeling paint and a window that stuck half open, because it was all I could afford. I took cleaning jobs, ironing jobs, anything that would keep the lights on. I learned how to stretch a bag of rice and a few vegetables into a week's worth of meals. Nights, when exhaustion finally loosened my body's grip, my mind replayed every gesture, every conversation we'd had in our marriage, searching for the moment everything had cracked. The only thing that made sense was this. He had chosen himself. He had abandoned me to the wreckage of his mistakes. He had cut himself free and let me sink with the debts and shame. For years, anger was the only thing that kept me from disappearing into a sorrow I didn't know how to carry. Now, sitting in a hospital corridor with my hands cold around a styrofoam cup of coffee, I realized how fragile that anger felt next to the image of him fainting into my arms, his body as light and empty as an old coat. A doctor finally approached, gray-haired, tired-eyed, with a clipboard tucked under his arm. He asked my name, confirmed Elias's, and gave me a summary in a voice that managed to be both clinical and gentle. "Your ex-husband is severely malnourished," he said. "He's dehydrated, anemic, and shows signs of infections that have been untreated for some time. His body has been living under extreme strain for years." "Will he live?" I asked. "He's stable for now," the doctor replied. "We've hydrated him, started antibiotics, and he's responding. But his recovery will depend on more than what we can do today." "Does he have anyone else? Family? Friends? A place to stay if we discharge him?" I shook my head slowly. "I don't know anymore," I said. "The last time I knew anything about his life was almost 20 years ago." The doctor studied my face for a moment with quiet understanding. "Sometimes," he said, "the body keeps walking long after life has collapsed. We'll do what we can. You can see him once he's out of emergency." Hours later, when they finally allowed me into his room, I paused in the doorway, hand on the frame. He lay on a narrow bed under harsh white light, wrapped in a thin blanket that did nothing to hide how diminished he had become. Tubes snaked from his arms, and a bag hung like a small, clear moon at his side. His hair, now fully gray, had been pushed back from his forehead, revealing deep lines and sunspots. Without the dirt, his face seemed at once older and more vulnerable. For a moment, I almost turned away. It felt like intruding on someone else's tragedy. The man I had loved, angrily, painfully, and then not at all, had become this fragile stranger, broken by a life I knew nothing about. I stepped inside. He opened his eyes slowly, as though dragging them up from the bottom of a well. When he saw me, confusion flickered first, then alarm, then something softer that he tried to hide. "You're still here," he said, voice rough but clearer than it had been by the dumpster. "Where else would I be?" I asked. "Anywhere else," he whispered. "You walked away when you had the chance." I pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, folding my hands in my lap. "You fainted in my arms," I reminded him. "They asked if there was someone they could call. I didn't even know what to say. I'm the only one left who remembers you as more than a shadow." He flinched almost imperceptibly, as if the word remember had cut something tender. "I never wanted you to see this part," he said. His gaze slid away to stare at the wall. "The plan was that you would keep your life, whatever pieces you managed to rebuild, far away from the mess I became." The plan. My voice sharpened. What plan? Because from where I stood, it looked like there was no plan at all. You vanished. You left a letter that could have been written by a stranger. And then everything fell apart. He closed his eyes for a moment and exhaled slowly. I know, he said. I watched from far away, more than once when I shouldn't have. I saw what it did to you. A chill ran up my spine. You watched me? He nodded once, guilty. From across streets, from corners, from the back of crowds. I had to be sure you were still breathing. But they hadn't. He cut himself off. Who hadn't? I pressed. His fingers curled into the sheet, tendons taut under thin skin. For a long time, he said nothing, the silence pressing heavier than any answer. I heard the steady beep of the monitor, the distant murmur of voices in other rooms. The day I disappeared, he began at last, was the day I was supposed to die. I stared at him. The words didn't fit any reality I recognized. Don't say things like that, I protested. You chose to leave. That's what the letter said. You chose to abandon everything. He let out a small, bitter laugh. I did choose, he said. Only the choice wasn't between staying and leaving. It was between your life and my honesty. He turned his head slowly to look at me directly. For the first time since the ambulance, his gaze held steady, as if bracing itself. Mara, he said quietly, I didn't lose everything because I was reckless. I lost everything because I obeyed. The confusion that had been simmering in me flared into anger. Obeyed who? I demanded. Who could possibly have the right to order you to destroy our life? He swallowed hard. It was like watching someone force down poison. People who own more than lives, he said. People whose names you read in headlines, whose faces appear on building plaques and in campaign posters. People who never wanted their secrets touched. His words seemed too big for the small hospital room. Suddenly, decades of half-remembered images rearranged themselves in my mind. The way his phone had started ringing at odd hours toward the end, the increasing tension in his shoulders, the projects he mentioned less and less at home. The arguments we'd had that neither of us knew how to finish. What did you do? I asked, the question tasting like shame and fear combined. What I always did, he replied hollowly. I signed things. I checked the numbers. I approved designs. I believed that if the calculations were sound, the rest was none of my concern. Until it was. He stared past me, eyes clouding as he slipped back into old memories. There was a contract, he said. A big one, bigger than anything I'd worked on before. Government money, public works, layers of subcontractors. At first, I thought it was just complicated. Too many companies, too many hands in the same pot. But the more I looked, the more the numbers didn't match. Invoices for materials that never arrived. Payments to companies with no offices, no real employees. Altered blueprints that didn't make sense except to hide the missing pieces. I listened silently, my heart beating too fast. I made the mistake of asking questions, he went on. Not loudly, not publicly. Just a few pointed concerns to the wrong person. 2 days later, I was called into a private meeting. With every sentence, his voice grew quieter. There were 3 men in that room, he said. Only one of them worked for the firm. The others didn't need business cards. They laid everything out on the table, photos, documents, numbers that proved they knew exactly what I'd seen. They told me very calmly that the project was bigger than me, bigger than my ethics, bigger than any illusion I had of justice. My signature was already on too many documents. If I tried to report anything, the evidence would point to me as the mastermind behind the fraud. That's not how it works, I said weakly, even as I imagined offices where such things were precisely how it worked. He smiled without humor. It's exactly how it works when the people who design the rules also design the crimes, he said. They showed me witness statements already written, transfer records that could be rearranged with a keystroke. They explained how quickly someone with my profile could be turned into a public villain, how easy it would be to make the story stick. And you believe them? I asked. I didn't, he said. Not first. I told them I'd go to the authorities anyway. I thought this was just intimidation. Then they slid a photograph across the table toward me. His eyes met mine, and a chill passed through me before he even said it. It was you, he whispered, coming out of our building with a bag of groceries, walking down the street alone. Underneath the photo, was a list of your habits. The times you left for work. The name of the bus route you sometimes took. The days you visited your sister. The corner where you liked to buy flowers when you could spare a little extra. My throat closed. Suddenly, the vague unease I had felt during those months before he disappeared, the odd sensation of being watched, of hearing footsteps behind me that vanished when I turned, crystallized into something sharp. They told me, Elias continued, voice shaking now, that accidents happen every day. Gas leaks, muggings gone wrong, cars losing their brakes at the wrong moment. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't threaten. They just described possibilities. And then they told me I had two options. I could fight and watch you die, slowly or suddenly, in some perfectly plausible tragedy. Or I could disappear into the story they had already written for me. He fell silent. The monitor beeped steadily beside him. I realized my hands were clenched, so hard my nails dug into my palms. So you left, I said numbly. You left me with the debts, with the hate, with the mess, because it was safer for me to think you were a coward than to know the truth. Yes. He did not try to soften it. You had to believe I had chosen myself, or you would have gone looking. You would have asked questions. You would have gotten close to a fire that burns anyone who steps too near. And all the debts. I asked hoarsely. All the loans in your name with my forged signature? The house they took? The jobs I had to beg for? Was that part of the punishment they designed? Or something you agreed to? He swallowed. It was the proof they wanted that I would play my role, he said. They needed a scapegoat who lost everything. A public fall. Empty accounts, seized assets, a wife abandoned and ruined. The perfect narrative. The innocent engineer is corrupted by greed, leaving his spouse in misery. They thought it would send a clear message to anyone else who might dream of speaking. And you agreed to that, I said. My voice was barely more than a breath. You signed away everything we had, and then disappeared and let me drown in a life you had chosen for me. His eyes glittered with tears. I thought, he said haltingly, that ruin was better than a grave. That poverty was better than a funeral. I told myself that if you hated me enough, you would stop being watched. That as long as the story held, you would remain a background figure, the collateral damage of my supposed crimes, not a target in your own right. I looked at him, at the lines carved into his face, at the shame that had bent his back long before hunger did. The anger I had carried for so long rose in me again, fierce and hot, but it was tangled now with something far more dangerous, understanding. All these years, I whispered, I thought you had destroyed my life out of selfishness, out of weakness. And all this time, you were what? Destroying yours instead in the shadows. If I had told you the truth back then, he said, they would have silenced both of us. I chose the only kind of protection I had left to give you. My absence. I pressed my fingers against my lips. My mind ran through the last decades, rearranging scenes like pieces of a puzzle finally sliding into place. My eviction from the house, the friends who drifted away, the nights I sat alone in a rented room, hating a man who was somewhere out there paying for my life with his. Why now? I asked. Why tell me this now, after all these years? Why let me see you at all? He closed his eyes and turned his face toward the wall. When he spoke, his voice was very small. Because they stopped watching, he said, or I thought they had. Something in his tone told me I had only scraped the surface of what lay beneath his confession. Fear, old and new, settled in my bones. Outside the room, the hospital moved on indifferent. Inside, my history had just rewritten itself in front of my eyes. I had lived for years inside a lie built for my protection. Now, that lie was cracking, and whatever waited behind it was not going to stay quiet for long. The hours that followed Elias's confession stretched thin and taut. I drifted between his room and the waiting area, between his haunted eyes and my own memories. Sleep was a luxury my body refused. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that photograph he described. The one with me coming out of our building, oblivious to the invisible crosshairs drawn around my life. Elias dozed fitfully, exhausted from both illness and the weight of finally speaking. When he slept, he muttered to himself, fragments of apologies and numbers and names that made no sense to me. When he woke, his gaze searched for me with a strange mixture of dread and relief. "Go home," he told me more than once. "You don't need to be here." "I needed you to explain yourself for 20 years, I answered. "I'm not leaving now just because it's uncomfortable." He would fall silent then, some stubborn part of him knowing better than to push further. The second night, the hospital halls seemed to lengthen. Lights dimmed, but they never really went dark. I walked their length, passing rooms filled with whispered grief, sharp pain, dull routine. I thought of the life I had rebuilt after he left, piecemeal, fragile, stitched together with odd jobs and small kindnesses, with humiliation and stubbornness. Had it been real, or had it been nothing more than the stage set built around a woman who was never supposed to know what had really happened? By dawn, I was back at his bedside. Elias awoke with a start, as if emerging from a nightmare. For a moment, he looked at me, as though he expected the bed to be empty, the chair beside him abandoned. "You stayed," he murmured. "I'm not the one who runs anymore," I said. A faint, crooked smile tugged at his lips. Then it faded. The lines around his eyes deepened. "There's more I never told you," he said quietly. "Things you'll wish you didn't know." "It's too late for that warning," I replied. "I already wish I didn't understand as much as I do. But understanding is all I have left now. Don't make me live half a life again." He lay still for a long moment, looking up at the ceiling as if searching for strength in the cracks and lights. "When I chose to fall," he began, "when I signed everything and let them build their story around my ruin, I didn't do it completely blind. I kept one card in my pocket, a last piece of truth they didn't know about." I sat forward. "What do you mean?" He turned his head to look at me, and I saw a hint of the engineer he had once been in the way he spoke, methodical even through pain. "I took copies," he said, "before they controlled the narrative completely, before they wrapped me in their guilt. Every contract I signed, every fake invoice, every list of shell companies, every photograph of the real sites and the ghost ones. I kept digital copies, physical copies, names, dates, the entire thread of their theft. It was dangerous, stupid, desperate, but I couldn't let them bury everything under my name." "And where is all that now?" I asked, feeling my pulse quicken. He hesitated, as if the answer itself were a threshold we couldn't cross. "Hidden," he said at last. "You remember the workshop I used to rent in the South District? The one where I kept my tools and old projects?" I nodded. I had spent many evenings there, bringing him sandwiches and coffee while he tinkered with prototypes and repairs. The smell of oil and dust and metal still lingered somewhere in my mind. "After they pushed me out," he continued, "I went there one last time. I had already set aside the copies of everything that mattered. I put them in a metal box. Then I made a false wall behind one of the shelves and buried the box there. If anyone looked, it was just another old wall in a forgotten workshop." "You kept this to yourself all these years?" I asked. "You never used it?" "Not once. Not even when you were sleeping on the streets." His jaw clenched. "Every time I thought of it, I saw your face lying still in some morgue," he said. "Don't you understand? The box was a loaded weapon. If anyone discovered it, if anyone suspected I still had evidence, they would have made sure there was nothing left to connect to me, including you. So you held the proof of their crimes and chose silence." "I chose your breath," he corrected softly. "Every day I woke up and you were still alive somewhere. Even if you hated me, was the day that box stayed buried. The injustice of it pressed against my ribs. They had used my life as a leash around his neck. My ruin, my loneliness, my hunger, these had been the collateral they were willing to tolerate as long as he followed their script. How do you know they aren't still watching?" I asked. "How do you know going after that box now won't bring everything crashing down on us?" "I don't know," he admitted. "That's the problem. For years, I tuned my life to their expectations. I learned what I could and couldn't do. I wandered enough to be invisible, but never enough to draw attention. I thought if I stayed completely broken, they'd forget about me, replace me with new pawns. And did they?" I pressed. He looked away. "For a while, maybe, long enough for the fear to dull. It's only recently that I started seeing old faces in new places. Men who stood too long at corners, who asked after me by name instead of avoiding it. So they had never really forgotten. They had simply turned down the heat until he stopped struggling. Elias, I said slowly. I can't go back to ignorance. Not after everything you've said. I spent decades thinking I'd been abandoned out of selfishness. Now, I know my life was a bargaining chip in a game I never chose to play. I can't let that stand. Justice has never come without a price, he said. I already paid mine. Yours is still negotiable. I've already paid mine too, I replied. In lost years, in humiliation, in hunger. I just didn't know whose debt I was paying. I won't spend the rest of my life pretending none of it mattered. His hand, thin and bruised with needle marks, tightened around the edge of the blanket. If you go after that box, he said, if you bring its contents to light, they won't just target me. They'll come for you. They already came for me, I said quietly. They just did it with paperwork and silence instead of guns. The worst they could do to me now is finish what they started. And I'm not sure I'd rather die ignorant than risk dying informed. We stared at each other, years of shared history hanging between us like a thread stretched to breaking. Tell me exactly where, I said. He exhaled a long, defeated sound. Then he told me the address of the old workshop, the layout of the back room, the shelf he had reinforced himself, the false panel disguised behind stacked boxes. He described the metal box, gray, dented on one corner, locked with a small key he had kept on a chain for months before hiding that too in a place I would never have suspected if he hadn't told me. Why tell me now? I asked again. Why not take this secret to the grave and leave me in peace? Because they've seen me again, he said simply. Because someone, somewhere, will report that the ghost they ruined is still walking. Because sooner or later, they'll remember the engineer who used to double-check every figure and wonder if he really left nothing behind. And if they find that box before you do, everything we've lived through will have been for nothing. His voice shook on the last words. For a moment, I saw beneath the layers of exhaustion and guilt the stubborn man I had once known. The one who could not leave a misaligned beam or a crooked measurement alone, who believed that the right structure could stand against storms. I'll go, I said. No, he answered immediately. It's too dangerous. And leaving it there's what? Safe. I shook my head. You already sacrificed our life together once to keep me breathing. I won't let you sacrifice it again to keep me ignorant. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. His shoulders sagged. If you go, he said, you must move like someone who knows she's being watched. You must assume every car that slows is theirs. Every face that lingers is an enemy. You must not take everything at once. Hide copies. Give them to people who still believe in something beyond power. Do you know any such people? I asked. He closed his eyes. Maybe, he said. But that's a question for after you bring the box. The next morning, the city felt different when I stepped outside. The light seemed harsher. Every reflection in a window, a possible pair of eyes. The taxi I hailed took me to the South District, passing streets I hadn't visited in years. The neighborhood around the old workshop had changed. New buildings had sprouted where warehouses once stood, and graffiti now covered walls that used to be plain. The workshop itself stood stubbornly where it always had, squeezed between a mechanic's garage and a storage depot. Its sign was faded, letters peeling. A for rent. Notice lurked in one dusty corner of the front window. The door, surprisingly, was still locked with the same old cylinder. I hesitated only a moment before using the thin, rusted key Elias had scavenged from memory. The lock protested, then turned with a tired click. Inside, the air was thick with dust. Light filtered in through grimy windows, outlining floating motes like tiny ghosts. The workbenches were still there, though most of the tools had been stripped away. A couple of stools sat where we had once shared coffee while he explained structural diagrams to me as if they were poetry. I moved quietly, though there was no one to hear me. My footsteps echoed in the empty space. In the back room, I found the shelf he had described, a tall metal frame bolted to the wall, still loaded with boxes of old cables, cracked plastic bins, and forgotten parts. His directions came back to me step by step. Third shelf from the bottom. 2 boxes to the right. A small gap in the metal frame. I pulled boxes aside, my hands trembling. Behind a row of paint cans, I felt the cool edge of a panel that didn't quite match the rest of the wall. I wedged my fingers into the gap and pulled. At first, nothing moved. Then, with a soft grinding sound, the panel shifted. A small cavity yawned behind it, barely large enough for a shoebox. Nestled inside, coated with a thin layer of dust, was the metal box he had described. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size, as if the contents pressed against time itself. The lock on the box bore a familiar scratch pattern. I remember the evenings when he had sat at our kitchen table, absently turning a small key between his fingers while we talked about the day. At the time, I thought it was just a nervous habit. Now I understood it had been a man carrying a secret too big for his pockets. He had described the lock and the trick to opening it without the original key, a bent nail inserted at just the right angle, a twist and push. I had doubted my hands would remember such finesse. To my surprise, the lock clicked open with a small, anticlimactic sound. Inside lay folders carefully stacked, protected by plastic sleeves. USB drives labeled with dates. Photographs clipped to contracts. Copies of ledgers, stamped and signed. And among all of it, woven like a thread pulling everything together, our names. I saw my own signature where I had never signed. I saw my initials on guarantees I had never read. I saw documents that listed me as a beneficiary of shell companies I had never heard of. The story they had built around us was carefully constructed, terrifyingly complete. The urge to sit down right there on the dusty floor and read everything was almost overwhelming. But the memory of Elias's warning kept me moving. I flipped through enough pages to confirm what I already suspected. This was no small fraud. It was a tree with roots curling through banks, construction firms, political offices, courts. Names leapt out from the pages. Names I had heard in news reports and campaign slogans. Names that had floated above ordinary lives like untouchable constellations. Now they were here, on paper, bound in numbers that did not lie. I closed the box, heart pounding. I wrapped it in a faded tarp I found in a corner, then slid it into a plain shopping bag I had brought along. From the outside, it looked like groceries, nothing more. When I stepped back out into the street, the air felt sharper. A car sat idling half a block away, its windows tinted darker than necessary. As I walked toward the busier intersection, the engine revved softly. The car didn't move immediately, but my skin prickled. Objectively, it could have been a coincidence. But coincidence felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. I turned the corner and slipped into a small grocery store crowded with people. I walked its aisles slowly, pretending to examine cans and cereals while I watched through the front window. After a few minutes, the car rolled past. The driver's face was indistinct behind the glass. My breath caught until the vehicle turned at the end of the street and disappeared. Someone had followed me, or I had imagined it. Either way, from that moment forward, every shadow felt a fraction too dark. I returned to the hospital with the bag, clutched to my chest like a living thing. In Elias's room, the beeping machines hummed their quiet monotony. He opened his eyes when he heard the door. "You went," he said. It wasn't a question. I set the bag under the bed, out of sight. "It was where you said it would be," I replied. "All of it. More than I expected." He closed his eyes briefly, an expression of something like relief crossing his face. "Then there's no turning back now," he said. "There never was," I answered. "We just didn't know it." For a while, we simply sat there, the box hidden between us like a third presence. The hospital seemed suddenly too small to contain what we had brought inside it. "What are you going to do with it?" he asked finally. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I know what I won't do. I won't bury it again." He nodded slowly, though his face was marked with worry. "We're moving pieces on a board we don't control," he said. "Every step we take will push them to move, too." "Then let them move," I replied. For once, I won't be the one pushed around without knowing why. As I said it, I realized that fear and determination could coexist in the same chest. My hand shook. My voice did not. The box had come out of the wall. The truth had risen from the ground. And whatever storm followed would now have to reckon not only with the man they'd broken, but with the woman they had underestimated for too long. The first person I called was a journalist I barely knew. He had been a name in the background of my life when I was younger, One of those reporters who occasionally surfaced with stories about scandals that everyone suddenly pretended to be surprised by. Years ago, he had exposed a mid-level bribery scheme that briefly shook the city before it sank back into complacency. I remembered watching him on television once, his hair thinner than the young anchors, his tie a little crooked, speaking in calm, precise sentences that made powerful men look uncomfortable. His name was Arturo. Finding his number took effort and a favor from a neighbor whose son worked at a local radio station. When I finally dialed it, my hands were damp. He answered with a short, cautious hello. I introduced myself, stumbling through an explanation of why I had thought of him. He listened in silence until I said the words evidence, corruption, and decades. "What exactly do you have?" he asked, his tone abruptly sharpened. "Contracts," I said. "Invoices. Ledgers. Names. Connections between public works and private pockets. Recorded threats. And proof that an innocent man was destroyed to keep all of it hidden." There was a pause. I imagined him weighing whether this was the rambling of a confused woman or the opening to something real. "Can you meet?" he asked. "Somewhere quiet." We chose a small cafe on the edge of a park far from both the hospital and my neighborhood. The kind of place where old men played cards over coffee and music played just loud enough to blur individual conversations. I arrived early, the box's contents reduced to a single folder in my bag. I hadn't been foolish enough to carry everything. The rest I had already copied and hidden, following Elias's bitter advice. One set in a safety deposit box in a bank no one important ever paid attention to. Another set given to a cousin in the countryside under the vague explanation of family papers. The original box remained under Elias's hospital bed, wrapped in a blanket like a child. When Arturo walked in, he looked exactly as I remembered, older, a little stooped, but with eyes that missed nothing. He sat across from me, ordered a coffee he barely touched, and said, "Show me." I slid the folder across the table. He opened it with the slow care of a man trained not to react too quickly. His gaze skimmed numbers, names, signatures, stamps. The color drained slightly from his face. His fingers paused on a page listing a fake company address that linked meticulous transfers to a government department. He stopped and closed the folder, pressing his palm flat on top of it. "If these documents are authentic, this isn't a story," he said. "It's an earthquake." "They're authentic," I said. "My life is proof of that." I told him then, condensed but not softened, the story of Elias, the threats, the force fall, the years of ruined existence. I told him about the hidden box, the workshop, the photograph of my face on a table where my life had been casually weighed against money. Arturo listened without interrupting. When I finished, he let out a long breath. "You understand what you're stepping into?" he asked. "I understand that I've been living in the rubble of someone else's protection," I replied. "If I stay quiet now, my whole life will have been nothing more than the debris left after someone else's crime." "You're not just asking for justice for one man," he said. "You're offering to set fire to an entire network. They won't respond gently. They already burned us," I said. "This time, they won't be the only ones choosing the match." He gave a brittle smile. "You have copies?" he asked. "Yes." "Places they don't know about?" "Yes." "People you trust?" "Too," I said. "No more. I don't have that many friends left." He nodded. "Good. Don't trust anyone you don't have to. Not even me, completely." I almost laughed at that. "If I trusted you completely, I wouldn't be here with only a fraction of the documents," I said. His eyes crinkled at the corners, just for a second. They hardened again. "I'll start verifying every piece," he said, quietly. "Some of these names will have eyes everywhere. Once we move, we can't stop. You need to prepare for your life to stop being your own." "My life stopped being my own a long time ago," I answered. "I just didn't know who was using it." That night, I returned to the hospital and told Elias what I had done. His face went pale, then oddly serene. "Then the clock started," he said. "They won't wait until the story is printed. They'll feel the walls closing in as soon as anyone begins asking the wrong questions in the right offices." As if summoned, the first signs appeared within days. Strange men began to appear in the hospital corridors, well-dressed but out of place. They walked slowly, glancing into rooms as if searching for someone they were not supposed to know. They asked nurses about patients who didn't exist, hovering near Elias's ward for just a beat too long. When they noticed me watching, they would look away with practiced indifference and walk off. One afternoon, a man in a dark jacket leaned in the hallway near Elias's door, pretending to study the fire evacuation plan posted on the wall. His eyes flicked to the bed every few seconds. When our gazes met, he forced a quick smile and left abruptly. My skin prickled. The doctor who had first treated Elias pulled me aside one evening. "Be careful," he said quietly. "Today, 3 different men asked about your ex-husband. They say they're from social services, from different offices, but the paperwork doesn't quite match." Fear clawed at the back of my throat. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing more than the law requires," he said. "The charts, the condition, nothing about visitors or personal history. But this is not my usual interest. Whatever he is caught up in, you're caught now, too." "I've been caught for years," I said. "The difference is that this time I know whose hands are on the net." He gave me a searching look, as if trying to decide how much truth I could bear. "If you decide to run," he said, "do it quickly. With people like this, hesitation is dangerous." "I'm done running," I replied. Arturo called late one night, his voice tight. "They broke into my office," he said. "Took nothing of value. No money, no computers. Just some files. And they left a note." "What did it say?" I asked, though I already knew. "Leave the past buried," he recited, "or we bury you with it." My fingers tightened around the phone. "Are you going to stop?" I asked. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "At my age," he said, "I've already made peace with the fact that I won't die rich. I might as well try not to die useless." Despite the fear, the line made a shaky smile tug at my mouth. "Then we keep going?" I said. He did keep going, and so did the danger. One evening, as I returned to the tiny apartment I had rented after losing my house years ago, I noticed the door slightly ajar. My heart lurched. I hadn't left it that way. I paused on the stairs, listening. No sound came from inside. The hallway was empty. I pushed the door open with 2 fingers. The room had been turned over carefully. Not violently. Drawers open but not emptied. Books pulled from shelves and set back slightly crooked. Photographs taken from the wall, examined, and replaced upside down. Nothing of material value was missing. Not that I had much to steal, but my old wedding album was gone. They weren't looking for money. They were sending a message. I returned to the hospital that night with my hands shaking and told Elias what had happened. He closed his eyes, and I watched fear flicker there. Not for himself, but for me. "They're reminding you that they can walk through your life whenever they want," he said. "Just like they walked through mine." "They already did," I replied, "without my knowledge. Now, they'll have to walk through it knowing I'm watching." His health deteriorated as the pressure increased. The years of malnutrition and stress had worn his body thin. Some days, his breathing was so labored that speaking more than a few sentences made him cough until tears came to his eyes. Other days, he seemed almost like the man I remembered, sharp, wry, stubborn. On one of those better days, he grabbed my hand and squeezed it with surprising strength. "If I don't see the end of this," he whispered, "promise me you won't stop. Promise me you won't let them turn my fall into a footnote again." "I promise," I said, my throat tight. "You won't be the ghost they built. You'll be the crack that brought them down." Outside the hospital, the city began to tremble with rumors. Newspaper articles hinted at irregularities in major contracts. Anonymous sources spoke of missing funds and shadowy companies. Names were not yet printed, but they were being whispered in halls that had been quietly corrupt for years. The district attorney who had once dismissed cases like mine as lost causes called Arturo in for a private conversation. A few days later, I was summoned to his office. He was younger than I expected, though fatigue had carved years into his face. The walls of his office were lined with books and framed degrees, the air smelling of paper and coffee. He motioned for me to sit. "I've seen the documents," he said without preamble. "I've cross-checked what I could in a short time. If this is a fabrication, it's the most sophisticated one I've ever encountered." "I don't think it is." "It's not," I said. "My life is the collateral." He nodded. We're dealing with a network that's been feeding from public money for at least 2 decades, he said. Construction firms, shell companies, people inside my own institution. Some of the names in those papers sit on boards, on councils, on campaign committees. If we open this the wrong way, they'll shut it before it breathes. Then open it the right way, I said. I didn't claw my way through these years just to hand this truth to your office, so it can disappear into a drawer. He studied me for a long moment. You understand that once you give formal testimony, you will no longer be an anonymous victim, he said. You will be the face attached to this case. You will be dragged through the mud. They will call you a liar, an accomplice, an opportunist. I've been called worse in private, I replied. At least this time, I'll know why. He exhaled slowly. We'll move quickly, he said. Seize records before they can erase them. Freeze accounts. Raid offices. We need enough pressure that they start turning on each other, each trying to save their own skin. And my ex-husband? I asked. His name is all over those fake accusations. He was the public scapegoat. If we succeed, the DA said, we'll have grounds to exonerate him completely. To recognize him as a victim of extortion and threats, not as a criminal. It won't give him back his years, but will give him back his name. That promise became the fragile thread I clung to as the storm broke. The first raids took place early on a gray morning. Police cars formed convoys, sirens flashing but not screaming, rolling towards sleek office buildings and anonymous warehouses. Arturo sent me brief messages as each operation began. They're in the main office now, server rooms seized. One of them tried to slip away out the back door. News trickled onto the television hours later. Anchors spoke in careful tones about suspicions of irregularities, about major figures under investigation. They didn't yet say the words corruption network, but it hung in the air. The names that dropped into the public domain over the next few days were the same ones I had seen in the documents. Presidents of consortia, CEOs who had built empires on concrete and steel, ex-officials who had moved seamlessly from public office to private boardrooms. Their faces appeared on screens, caught off guard by cameras as they were escorted into vehicles, covering themselves with jackets and folders. But the counterattacks came just as quickly. I received anonymous calls that hung up as soon as I answered. A car tried to push me off a crosswalk one night as I left the hospital, its brakes screeching a second too late. An orderly who had been friendly to me from the first day pulled me out of the way just in time. The car sped off, license plate obscure by mud. Someone slipped a note under Elias's door while he slept. The nurse found it later crumpled on the floor when she came to check his vitals. The paper contained only 3 words, written in sharp, angry handwriting. This isn't over. I know, I said when I read it. That's why we keep going. 2 days later, the DA called me to testify formally. Walking into the courthouse felt like walking into the mouth of a beast. The building loomed above the plaza, its steps crowded with journalists and cameras. Microphones jutted toward me like spears, their questions a tangled chorus I didn't try to answer. How does it feel to bring such powerful men down? Do you see yourself as a hero? Do you fear for your life? Were you complicit? I kept my eyes ahead, my jaw set. Inside, the air was cooler, the noise muffled by stone walls. The hearing room was bright and echoing, its high ceiling watching over rows of wooden benches. Behind a table sat some of the men whose signatures I had memorized in the documents. In person, they looked smaller than their public images, but no less dangerous. When they called my name and swore me in, my hands trembled around the Bible. Not because I was afraid of lying, but because I was finally allowed to tell the truth. They asked if I recognized the documents shown to me. I did. They asked how they had come into my possession. I told them about the workshop, the false wall, the metal box buried like a time capsule of crimes. I told them about the threats laid on the table alongside my photograph, about the choice forced on Elias between my life and his integrity. As I spoke, I saw anger and panic flicker across the faces of the men who had once believed themselves untouchable. Some stared at me with barely disguised hatred. Others kept their eyes fixed on the table, knowing the cameras were recording. When I mentioned the forged signatures that tied me personally to their schemes, One of the defendants stood abruptly, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She's lying," he shouted. "This is all a setup, orchestrated by that man to get revenge. She's just a bitter ex-wife, trying to profit from a scandal." The judge's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "Sit down," he ordered. "You will have your turn to speak. For now, you will let the witness finish." The DA turned to me. "Do you have any financial gain from this process, Ms. Rivas?" he asked. "Financial gain?" I repeated, almost laughing. "No. What I had was a house, a husband, a modest but decent life. I lost all of that. What I have now is a rented room, a cupboard with more memories than food, and the truth. That's all. If truth is a gain, then I suppose I'm finally rich." A murmur ran through the room. The judge's eyes softened as he looked at me, just for a second. My testimony lasted hours. When it finished, I stepped down from the stand with legs that felt like someone else's. Outside, the press waited again. I moved past them without answering questions, my mind already back in the hospital room where a man lay in a borrowed bed, his body more precarious every day. Elias's smile when I told him what had happened was small but dazzling. "They believed you?" he asked. "They didn't have a choice," I said. "The documents speak louder than any of us." He closed his eyes, a tear escaping from the corner. "Then maybe," he whispered, "it was worth it." "Not yet," I answered. "Not until they say your name out loud as something other than a warning." 3 days later, that moment came. The news broke in the early morning. A high official, a man whose face had been printed on campaign posters and featured in advertisements about progress, was arrested trying to leave the country with a false passport. On his laptop, investigators had found spreadsheets linking project codes to secret accounts, and among those lines, a name, Elias Rivas, listed as the designated scapegoat for multiple failed projects, his ruin explicitly described as necessary to protect leadership. The DA came to the hospital that afternoon, wearing a suit that looked more solemn than usual. He stood beside Elias's bed and cleared his throat. "Mr. Rivas," he said, "I'm here in my official capacity to inform you that all charges previously brought against you have been dismissed. You are no longer considered a suspect, but a victim of extortion and coercion." Elias blinked, as if the words were in a language he had forgotten. "Say it again," he whispered. "Your name has been cleared," the DA repeated. "The record will show that you were not responsible for the crimes attributed to you. Your role in exposing this network will be recognized in the final resolution." Elias looked at me, eyes shining with tears. I took his hand, feeling his bones like fragile sticks beneath the skin. "We did it," I said, my voice breaking. "After all these years, we did it." Around us, machines continued their steady beeping. Nurses moved past the door. Somewhere in the city, men in suits called lawyers made deals, tried to minimize their sentences. Somewhere, editorialists wrote about ethics and courage and the willpower of institutions that had once ignored people like me. In that small hospital room, however, only one thing mattered. A man who had carried a secret like a stone in his chest had finally been told that history would no longer remember him as a thief. "Maybe now I can rest," he murmured. "Don't you dare," I said, even as I felt the shadow of something heavier approaching. "We still have time to fill with something other than regret. Time, I would soon learn, is a cruel negotiator." The night after Elias's exoneration, the hospital felt strangely quiet, as if the building itself had exhaled. The constant hum of machines, the shuffle of footsteps, the murmur of nurses, it was all the same, and yet something intangible had shifted. I sat by his bed, watching his chest rise and fall. He seemed lighter somehow, as though the absence of that branded guilt had eased a burden no doctor's treatment ever could. His fingers lay relaxed on the blanket instead of clenched around the edge. "They'll move on to other stories soon," he said, voice faint. "New scandals, new villains. They always do." "Maybe," I said, "but your name will stay where it matters. On the papers that say you were innocent." He turned his head to look at me. In his eyes, I saw the young man I had once married, filtered through years of hardship but still recognizable. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what?" I asked. "For saving my life in the worst possible way. For every night you went to sleep thinking you were unlovable, he said. For every time you blamed yourself for my disappearance. For every humiliation you suffered alone while I watched from shadows like a coward. You were never a coward, I replied. Cowards don't choose to burn their lives down to keep someone else breathing. He smiled faintly. You always gave me too much credit. We talked until fatigue pulled at his eyelids. We talked about the early years, about the tiny apartment with its chipped tiles and rattling windows, about the days when we argued over nothing and made up over everything. We talked about the project that had drawn him into the web, how proud he had been at first, how honored to be trusted with something so big, how quickly pride had turned into dread. We didn't talk much about the years in between, the years of my hatred, of his exile. Those years lay between us like a scar, acknowledged but no longer raw. Sometime after midnight, while the city outside drifted in and out of uneasy dreams, the machines at his bedside pinged louder. Nurses hurried in. The doctor followed, brow furrowed. They whispered to each other, adjusting drips, checking monitors. I was ushered out into the corridor and left there with my hands pressed together so tightly my knuckles hurt. Time elongated, stretched, snapped. When the doctor finally emerged, his eyes already held the answer. We've done what we could, he said quietly. His body is very weakened. There's internal bleeding we can't fully control. I'm sorry. The words crashed over me like cold water. For a moment, I could not feel my legs. Then I forced myself back into the room. Elias lay under the same harsh white light, but his skin looked different now. Too pale, almost translucent. His breath was shallow. Machines beeped at a slower rhythm. I took his hand in both of mine. It was cooler than before. You did it, I whispered. You brought them down. You paid for it with everything you had, and now the truth is out. His eyelids flickered. He opened them slowly, focusing on my face with effort. A faint smile tugged at his lips. You're alive, he breathed. That was always the point. I was alive before, I said, tears blurring my vision. But I didn't know why. Now I do. He drew in a shaky breath. I wish, he began, then coughed. I tightened my grip. Don't spend your last strength on wishes, I said. We had enough of those. Let's keep this moment simple. For what it's worth, he said hoarsely, I never stopped loving you, even when you cursed my name. Especially then. I know, I replied. The knowledge hurt and soothed at the same time. And for what it's worth, I never really stopped either. I just stopped admitting it, even to myself. His eyes softened. A single tear slid down his cheek. Then it was worth it, he whispered. The monitor's beeping grew slower, more irregular. I rested my forehead against the back of his hand. Rest, I said. This time, I'll carry the story. He died with that faint smile still on his lips, his hand in mine. Outside, the city continued its ceaseless movement. Cars passed, lights changed, people watched the news or did not. For most of them, the scandal unfolding on their screens was just another headline. For me, it was the epilogue of a love story written in invisible ink. The funeral was small. A few distant relatives, a couple of nurses who had grown fond of him in his final days, the district attorney who stood awkwardly at the back, hat in his hands. There were no long speeches, no grand declarations. Just dirt falling on a simple coffin, the sound dull and final. Afterward, as people drifted away, the DA approached me. The state will issue formal reparations, he said. Financial compensation for the damages you both suffered. There will also be a public act acknowledging the injustice done to him and to you. I looked at the grave, at the fresh mound of earth. No amount of money will give him back the years he spent as a ghost, I said, or the years I spent hating a man I didn't understand. No, the DA agreed. But sometimes in our line of work, all we can do is put in writing what should never have happened. It isn't enough, but it's something that remains when people like us are gone. He left then, returning to offices where new cases already waited. I remained a while longer, listening to the wind move through the trees, feeling the weight of finality settle. In the weeks that followed, life slowly rearranged itself around the absence. The scandal that had toppled powerful men continued to unfold in courtrooms and newspaper columns. Trials began. Some of the accused pleaded guilty in exchange for reduced sentences. Others protested innocence, claiming they had been ignorant or trapped. Investigations crawled through their accounts, their emails, their carefully curated reputations. I received a thick envelope with official seals informing me of the financial reparation the state had authorized. The number printed there meant nothing to the 20 years I had lost, but it meant something practical. I no longer had to count every coin in my purse before buying bread. I no longer had to calculate whether I could pay both the rent and the electricity. I used part of the money to leave the cramped apartment that had been both prison and refuge. I found a modest place with white walls and a large window overlooking a park. Children played there in the afternoons. Old couples walked slowly under the trees. Dogs tugged at their leashes, eager and enthusiastic. I furnished the apartment simply. A table, 2 chairs, a bed, a bookshelf. I placed a single-framed photograph on the dresser. Me and Elias on our wedding day, younger and brighter, unaware of the shadow that would one day stretch over us. I did not place it there to sanctify him or to romanticize our pain. I placed it there as a reminder that before he became a cautionary tale and I became collateral damage, we had been 2 ordinary people who loved each other the best way we knew how. The public act of acknowledgement took place in a solemn hall adorned with flags and polished wood. Officials spoke into microphones about institutional failures and the courage of citizens who come forward. They pronounced Elias's full name and the words wrongfully accused in the same sentence. They asked forgiveness on behalf of the state for having taken so long to see what had been obvious to us for years. When they called me to the front and handed me a folder with the final resolution, cameras flashed. I stood there, an older woman in a plain dress, holding a document that recognized my suffering in formal, cold language. "Would you like to say something?" someone asked quietly. I considered all the words that had burned in me for years, the anger, the sorrow, the accusations. Then I thought of Elias's thin face as he died, relieved not for himself, but for me. "No," I said. "Everything that needs to be said is in there." I nodded toward the folder. "The rest belongs to silence." Later that night, alone in my new apartment, I sat by the open window and watched the sky darken. The city's lights flickered on, scattered stars anchored to the ground. Somewhere out there, people were talking about the scandal, speculating, judging. Somewhere, the men who had once decided my fate as if it were an inconvenient line item were facing cramped cells and long sentences. I did not feel the triumph I had once imagined. There was satisfaction, yes, in knowing that truth had not remained completely buried. But joy was too strong a word for what I felt. What I felt instead was a slow, deep quiet settling into the spaces where anger used to live. I drank tea slowly, my hands wrapped around the warm cup. On the table lay the last leftover contents of the metal box, copies of documents that no longer needed to be hidden. Among them, almost forgotten, was a small folded note I hadn't noticed before, wedged between 2 contracts. The handwriting on it was unmistakable. Mara, it read, "If you ever find this, it means I failed to keep you far enough from this mess. It means you're standing where I never wanted you to stand. I can't ask your forgiveness for the way I left. I don't deserve it. All I can ask is that you remember me not as the man who disappeared, but as the man who chose the only broken path left to save you. Losing you was the price I paid to keep you breathing. If you're reading this, it means you survived. That's my only victory." The tears that came then were different from the ones I had shed in the hospital, at the grave, in the courtroom. Those tears had been for loss, for injustice, for wasted years. These were for something else, a love that had traveled through lies and silence, emerging on the other side damaged but not entirely erased. I pressed the note to my chest for a moment, then folded it again and slipped it into the back of the framed wedding photograph. Not to forget, not to worship, simply to keep the story whole. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The headlines shifted to new crises. Trials concluded. Sentences were handed down. Some of the guilty adapted quickly to their new roles as disgraced figures. Others did not. The city absorbed the shock and continued on, as cities always do. I built a new routine. I woke to the sound of birds and distant traffic. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching people cross the park with the unhurried steps of those who believe their lives belong to them. Sometimes I volunteered at a small community center, helping older women fill out paperwork they didn't understand, translating bureaucratic jargon into human language. It felt like the least I could do, knowing how many traps can hide in fine print. When people asked about my past, I chose carefully how much to reveal. I told some that I had been widowed, others that I had been part of a case that made the news. Once in a while, when I sensed someone truly listening, I told the full story of a man who took the fall to protect his wife, of a box in a wall, of a truth that almost stayed buried. "You must hate them," one young woman said after hearing it all, her eyes blazing with indignation. "The ones who did this. The ones who looked you in the face and lied." "I did," I answered. "For a long time. Hate kept me upright when I didn't have anything else. But hate is a strange thing. If you carry it too long, it starts to own more of you than the people you're hating did." "So what do you feel now?" she asked. I thought about it carefully. "Tired," I said, "and I'm grateful. Tired of everything that happened. Grateful that in the end, the truth stood long enough to be seen. I don't know if that's forgiveness. Maybe it's just the peace of having survived. Sometimes sitting by my window, I think of the woman I was the day I saw Elias by the dumpster, frozen on the sidewalk, clutching a folder, torn between crossing the street and stepping toward him. I wonder what my life would look like if I had turned away. Perhaps safer in a narrow, blind way. Perhaps shorter, certainly emptier. Instead, I chose to walk toward a man bent under the weight of his own ruin. And in doing so, I walked toward the truth of my own life. I am 67 now. I own very little. I have no children to tell this story to, no grandchildren to warn about the invisible hands that manipulate lives. What I have is this: my breath, my memories, and a peace I once thought I would never feel. In the end, that is the greatest revenge I could ever take against those who tried to write my fate without asking me. I sit in the soft light of late afternoon. Children laugh in the park below my window. Someone is playing an out-of-tune guitar. A dog barks impatiently. A train passes in the distance. The world goes on, indifferent and beautiful in exactly the same measure. I close my eyes and breathe in. I am still here, alive, free, and for the first time in many years, I am not afraid.